The most influential ism in the country today appears to be Hindutva. It has taken a long time for this ideology to come of age. But what happened to the other ideological movements that began in the early 20th century? The RSS will turn 100 years old next year, but so will the Communist Party of India. Ambedkarism, Marxism, liberalism, Dravidianism, feminism, Gandhiism. What role are these great big isms of the 20th century playing in the 21st century? What relevance do they have today?
I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an a-leprechaun.
Why have there been casteism existing in the country still today?
Feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal
So the
rights.
nature of the system is to be as mean and rotten as you can, to try to maximize profit.
I'm Sudipto Mandal, and welcome to this episode of What's Your Ism? Hello and welcome to What's Your Ism? I'm Sudipto Mandal. Before I start today's show and introduce you to the guest, I just want to give a shout out to all those people who've been writing in with their comments on the YouTube link. I just want to make it a little easier for you from now on. I'm sharing my email ID. Please write to me. Tell me where I'm going wrong, what I could have asked differently, people I could have interviewed, things I could have asked. My email ID is sudipto@thenewsminute.com. That's sudipto@thenewsminute.com. Now, for today's guest, we have somebody from Bangalore, from somebody who's straight down the street from where our office, the News Minute office, is. He's a human rights lawyer, a queer rights activist, a scholar as well as a organizer. Arvind Narrain, thank you for coming on What's Your Ism?
Thanks, Sudipto. Thanks for the invitation.
And this question of what's your ism to an Arvind Narrain is a very, very broad question because of the many things you did. I kind of fumbled over there trying to list out those things. So, human rights law, there is this entire engagement with the Nas judgment between 2009 and 2018. You were engaged with this entire question of decriminalizing love and the central question of queer rights and in that. And now you're the president, the Karnataka state president of the PUCL. That is something that I found a little surprising. I'll come to that and where your engagement with PUCL comes from. But the other thing that I find very interesting that you're doing now is in the field of education. You're involved with the RB Charities. The RB Charity, of course, stands for Rai Bahadur Arkat Narayan Swami and his charities. He is an ancestor of yours. He was your grandfather, your great-grandfather?
Great-great-granduncle.
Great-great-granduncle. Yeah. Okay, I want you to talk a little bit about RBNMS and its history, but starting with the Rai Bahadur himself, such an interesting character. I'd gone to the institution and I picked up this little dossier from there in which I found that Arkat Narayan Swami had set up the first Dalit school in Karnataka in the year 1883. And his career, and then after that of his brothers and his sons and nephews, was all about setting up so many of these charities. But the fact that this happened in 1883 struck me. To give you a sense of to give the audience, I'm sure you have a sense of this, to give the audience a sense of how important this is. The first Dalit organization in Karnataka was started in 1905. We are talking about this first Dalit school having started in 1883. The Congress party was formed in 1835. That is 2 years after this thing. And just 2 years before the establishment of the school, the Wadiyars came back to power. So the British had for a period taken away the power from the Wadiyars, and they had installed their own administration. And then in 1881, they gave power back to the Wadiyars. The Wadiyars and their patronage gives this boost to this character called Rai Bahadur Arkat Narayan. He was Arkat Narayan Swami. Then he's conferred with Rai Bahadur, the title of Rai Bahadur, and then he gets engaged with something like this. So in that historical time period, 1883, this character, we've barely ever heard about these aspects of his life. What do you know? Can you tell us something about it?
Yeah, thanks, Sudipto, for this question. And I realized I also had not engaged very closely with the history of my great-great-granduncle till my cousin Sanjeev pulled me into the trust and said, you must contribute to the educational activities. And actually, it happened this way. We had the Independence Day program, which I think 2 years ago, which we were planning on celebrating for the school. And Sanjeev said, see, why don't you just speak on Rai Bahadur Arkarnaran Swami Mudlayan's contribution to constitutional values? I said, let me try, but give me the material. And then the material which you had is the same material which I had access to. And my eyes were really opened because we knew that he was a great grand uncle, but nothing really beyond that. And as you rightly said, what I found out is he was a man who became very wealthy through building of the various construction activities, dealing with Arak, as well as having a furniture shop, selling food stuff and utensils, moving from Chennai to Bangalore, etc. All of that he did, and that, I guess, lots of people might be wealthy, and so out of the lots of people, some people will have philanthropic impulse, and at that moment in time, as you rightly said, in the 19th century, if you have a philanthropic impulse, what did you do? You'd contribute to building a temple, and
Which
to
is
be
done
fair,
also.
He did that.
He did that.
He established the Chatram, which actually, that's another story. But you look at the Chatram, it's a very, in fact, I was there just yesterday. It's a very modest Chatram. No big gopuram or anything. It's a very modest little
This is also in
structure.
Alsur.
It's next to the school, actually.
The same school that we're speaking about over here.
Yeah.
Okay. So this school, by the way, is in Alsur.
Yeah.
Alsur is this very old area with a lot of history behind it. Anyway.
Yeah. So what I realized is that he established the Chatram, but he also has established an educational charities, and he established the first school in the cantonment area for Indians in English. And as Sudipta, as I don't know, I think many of our viewers, particularly from the Bangalore context, will all be students of St. Joseph's, St. Baldwin's, St. Germain's, and all the schools we all grew up with. But we should never forget, they were schools meant for Europeans, not for Indians. So the first school for Indians in the English medium was RBNMS. That's the first kind of a contribution that he made. And again, it shows a certain kind of a courage, certain kind of a vision, which is great. But in a sense, you're also representing the wider community you're from. I mean, you're representing your elite, you're representing the wealthy, and all of whom wants access to education. That makes sense. As you rightly said, the way he took several steps forward is establishing the first school for women in the area, which again, at that moment in time, as you're indicating, education for women was not on the priority. The independence movement had not begun, as you rightly indicated, and it is the independence movement which got women into the public sphere. Before that, you open a school for women or girls. And then he opened the first school for Dalits, what's called the Tirukulata school. That I thought was profoundly the most unique contribution he had made. Because look at it this way, again, the documentation which you have indicates how the Parayas were dealt with in the presidency at the moment in time. The sense of contempt and revulsion which the all other castes had towards the Parayas. And so I was thinking about it. I said, this man is unique, but I'm sure other people in his family would have said, why are you bothering with working on Dalit education? But obviously, he worked against his community to say, I'm going to establish the first school for Dalits. We don't have the documentation on this. I'd love to have, of course, if we had the documentation to find out what motivated him.
Can I hazard a guess?
Story, yeah.
So here I'm thinking is a monarch or a king, okay, who is a Shudra king. And here is a person knighted by that Shudra king who also comes from a non-Brahmin community. So Rai Bahadur Arkarnaran Swami is a Mudaliyar. And across Tamil history, you have this contestation between the Mudaliyar and the Brahmin. Some would even anecdotally say that the entire term Mudalayar, it comes in Tamil, Mudalayar means who is first? Mudalayar. Okay. And that term itself is a contestation of the Brahmin hegemony in a sense.
I think you're right about that.
That sentiment. Sorry. Do you think that so the non-Brahmin sentiment also, by the way, in the Mysore state, in a political sense, is sparked by the fact that there is a contest between the non-Brahmins who are let's say Kannada-speaking natives of Vokkaliga or Lingayat extraction, who have a problem with the bureaucracy, which is entirely made up of Tamil Brahmins. And then this entire non-Brahmin movement starts in Mysore. Further, there is reservations for non-Brahmins and all of that. But this sentiment, do you think, of extending the non-Brahmin solidarity to the Panchama, or the person who's outside the village, or the untouchable, you think comes from there? Because Adi Dravida as a term was already formed by then. You had Ayotitas and all these people already contemplating on these issues.
I think you're right about that. There is a progressive, obviously, he's sui generis in many ways, but he draws from the wider progressive current within his own community. I think you're right about that. And there is a wider progressive current within the Mudaliar community, which is critical of Brahmanism. And that's what he draws from. And that's again part of, I guess, my history, which I wasn't fully aware of till we had this Independence Day program, which we called Professor Ravi Verma Kumar to come. And he came in, he said, all this time I thought you were a Brahmin. He looked at me and said, I said, so what did I do? And then he said, no, I mean, this is your history. Why have you never spoken about this part of your history? The fact that there's a progressive current in your community, which needs to be talked about, needs to be brought forward, So that's when I realized that there's a lot about my own history which I didn't know about. And so I think you're right about that.
Right. And this history now, being rediscovered after this passage of so much of time, couldn't have been discovered at a better time. You're talking about constitutional values, you're talking about young people imbibing that in a generation that has perhaps not encountered it in their curriculum. What are you doing there? I want to know what you're doing with the charities.
The point which I was, which is where my story began, which is when Sanjeev asked me to do this talk on constitutional values and Rai Bahadur Karna and Swami Mudaliar. That's when I was making those kinds of connections and looking at what are the values which he stood for and what are the values which we are fighting for today, right? And one of the values, of course, is within the liberty, equality, fraternity, trinity is the question of fraternity. And fraternity, I think everybody, at least in our context by now knows, is not there as a term in the objectives resolution moved by Nehru. It enters the constitution after Ambedkar's intervention. So again, why was fraternity important for Ambedkar? You get the point. He puts it very simply and very clearly. He says, liberty and equality without fraternity is no deeper than a coat of paint. And his point is simple, that if you have only liberty, then dominance of the few. If you have only equality, you will suppress individual initiative. And for liberty and equality to flourish, you need fraternity, which is the idea of, again, solidarity. What you mean is a solidarity in society where people can actually interact across lines of caste. And that's the fundamental basis for a democracy. Again, the idea of, you go back to Ambedkar's idea of democracy. He says, again, people think democracy is about elections every 5 years. But in Ambedkar's understanding, he says democracy is a form of associated living, which again takes you back to the idea of social democracy and the idea that unless you have a solidarity within society, your democracy will be democracy for the few. So the vitality and the centrality of fraternity is what you get, which is what we need to take forward in the Indian Constitution. And I think that's the value, in a sense, which was articulated in the 1880s by Rai Bahadur Karna and Narrain Swami Mudaliar.
In 1883, right? 1883, it was an exclusively Dalit school. Now, I did visit this school, the RBNMS facilities, and Sanjeev Narain, who's the person who runs the daily affairs over there, and he has the. He says something interesting. He says 90% of the cohort is from Dalit/Adivasi, Dalit Bahujan, let's say, Adivasi perhaps not, Dalit Bahujan, Muslim, Christian, this whole catchment around the cantonment, which is, you're talking about a Nijipura, you're talking about a Murphy town, a Gautampura, these are the places from where young people are going to RBNMS. And he says 90% of my cohort is made up of the Bahujan population, or the subaltern population of Bangalore. And then Sanjeev goes on to show me this world-class swimming pool, these great cricket pitches, this great football pitch. And how he shows me that. I mean, I asked him, how are you able to fund this? And he says, well, we have a fairly large or a paying cohort as well, which is around 8 to 10%, 15% of our crowd is actually rich kids. So my question to him was, why are these rich kids coming to a school where 90% of the kids are from the Bahujan backgrounds? And then he takes me to see these facilities. And he says, this swimming pool, Nisha Millet comes over here. In this cricket ground, some of the top cricketers of Karnataka come here. In this football ground, a Chetri comes. Now, that is the tackle and lure, in a sense, where you are trying to create a fraternity by, a certain bit of some incentive somewhere, some encouragement somewhere else. These mixtures of coming up with cohorts, just in the formative years of a person, we talk about individual rights. The individual growing up in an ecosystem is also what you talk about, right? How does that? How difficult is that in a place like?
Perhaps one example one can share is this time's Independence Day program was again because of the involvement of people like Vinay Kumar and others. It was done in the RBNMS facility, and it was interesting to me because this program has happened in the past in the Airlines hotel premises, and you can see that you're right. The people who come for the program will be by and large, say, middle class, by and large, maybe more elite. But the RBNMS ground, because RBNMS, because it's catchment area, as you're putting it, draws in a different kind of a grouping. So the grouping there was very diverse, who attended the Independence Day program. So I think the school, by its location, can actually facilitate that conversation across lines of diversity. So that potential is very much there. So I would say that the school again can, this would be the interesting point today, you take forward that value of fraternity, where you're talking about people from diverse sections actually coming together. That's the potential it has. Again, we shouldn't get too carried away and say that's happening, but that's the potential which can take forward.
Okay, last thing about this, in this section about RBNMS, what do you think is a curriculum for change? There's so much of our time in the last few years has been taken up with this question of curriculum, how we read our history, how we read our civics, how we read our, how important do you think curricular aspects are in this, bringing up the new citizen?
It's a good question. And I don't have it in front of me, but the RBNMS has a vision statement.
No, not in respect to RBNMS, but generally as a thinker.
Yeah, but links up the vision statement and a mission statement. Mm-hmm. And the idea is, how can education contribute to the fullest development of the child's capacity, both in educational sense, in a cultural sense, in a sports sense, in a psychological sense. That's one dimension which education should contribute to. The other dimension, of course, is individual development is one part of it. But the connection is, when does the individual development link up to a wider notion of societal development? When does it become part of taking forward, in a broad sense, the ideals of, say, liberty, equality, fraternity? That's what you want education to do. You want education to do both allow the child, when the child is a young person, to contribute, to develop their own capacities and to make their way forward in life, as it were. But at the same time, there must be a way in which education equips you to cope with the problems we're contemporarily facing. There must be a way in which education can be about the rising trend of inequality, understand it, and how do you respond to it. It must be about addressing the issue of climate change. It must be about addressing the entire issue of peace and the question of justice as well, right? So those should be the objectives, I think, of an education in a broader sense. So you shouldn't compromise in the individual dimension, but you should never forget the collective dimension, because it's also about our collective future. And obviously, education today should be about training our kids, or getting our kids equipped to cope with the question of our collective future and what they can do to address the questions of our collective future.
Interesting. Thanks for that. Arvind, now moving on to other charities. Okay. The Alternative Law Forum, right? Of course, it's a side thing that it's located in the house in which you grew up, and you're one of the co-founders. But tell me, this is a very unique formation for me. I've been engaged with it as long as I've been a reporter, because I used to work in the Hindu. Straight down the road used to be the ALF office. And what I found there, and which was very unique, was these fraternities that you speak of. If I wanted a dipstick survey of civil society and what it's thinking about a variety of issues in Karnataka slash Bangalore. I spent a week in ALF. Everyone from every movement has come at least once and gone in a matter of over the course of a week. You have Dalit movements, left movements. People from all sorts of movements coming over there. It's become a kind of a hub, right? How was it imagined like that to start off with? What did you guys think about when you? So it was you, Lawrence Liang. Clifton was already there by then.
No, at the initial period, there was there's myself, there was Lawrence, there was Rupa, there was Purna, and a couple of other people who were involved at that moment in time. Clifton joined much later, the ALF. And a couple of points. I think one is ALF is imagined from the very beginning as a collective. And I think that's been integral to its survival and strength over, now we're marking the 25th year this year. And why I say that is, even in the question you asked, you didn't say you're the founder of ALF, which is, I think, an important point. Because ALF is not associated with any single person. That's its strength. That's its strength. There's no founder who overshadows it and says, this is my organization and I have full sway over it. You go to any of our colleagues now and speak to them, they have a full sense of ownership. They say ALF is theirs. And that's the important thing ALF has done, which has nourished different generations to come in and take ownership and possession and love of the place. Everybody loves the organization because they feel it's their organization. I think that's one key strength. Because I feel
in
that
terms of the model, explain to me, how does this work? In terms of technicalities, there's a pass out period, correct? You stay for a few years and then you have to leave?
It wasn't nothing as structured as that.
Okay.
I think it just happened to be the kind of both the structure in terms of the fact that it's a collective, and the fact of the individual strengths of the mentalities or the outlooks of people over there who felt that it's important for us to, and of course our advisory board, Mr. Arun and others, who said that you guys have to move on and make space for younger people. It was more a advisory board, of course. There's no mandatory thing, but we took that advice very seriously, saying it's very important because we want the place to survive, we want the place to grow, we want the place to be associated with new energies and new people, not just the same old faces again and again. So that strength, I think it's achieved, over the years. That's an important strength. Your second point is there have been other organizations which provide legal support to marginalized groups and communities, which is one part of what ALF does. But ALF also functions in a sense as a public space where we host a Friday forum with discussions on a range of events. And as you indicated, a range of civil society groups feel comfortable coming and sharing and coming and being a part of processes within ALF. So I think we've benefited enormously from that. Just as you say that you've benefited by coming there, I think we're benefited by you coming there because there's a way in which that connect happens, and it's unique in the sense it's got a semi-public place kind of a feel where people feel comfortable entering and sharing and just being in a space like that. That's not every office where people feel that sense of comfort. So I think that's the public space or semi-public space dimension, not just as hangout, but around, say, discussions, is what facilitates that interface with the wider public as far as ALF is concerned.
It's also, I've noticed over the years, of highly stressful and an extremely underpaid engagement. This ALF engagement is something that people look at as a sort of a rite of passage in the human rights world, but over time they move on and it's not sustainable. And that I think should also. Do you think we should talk about the stressors of life in a place like ALF, the kind of 247 cycle that you work with? There is an exodus of Northeast people in Karnataka, in Bangalore. The ALF lawyers are running around. There is a crackdown on, saying illegal Bangladeshis. ALF lawyers are on the ground. So the burnout.
I think, it is a challenging space. There's no doubt about it. But it's a choice people make to work in this kind of a space. And I think the strength, of course, is that it's not ALF anymore. ALF, there's Manthan law, then there's Samta law, range of other lawyers who are doing this kind of work. So there's a way in which this legal energy or legal imagination has multiplied itself, in the span of time over the 25 years. So that's why I think it's ALF is just one part, of a wider really ecosystem of resistance or ecosystem of alternative thinking, or how we choose to uh, frame it. And the question of, I think it's a good thing if people leave, only for the reason that younger people with newer energies come in, and that's the strength which I think it has managed over a period of time. The question of should people be paid more, etc., that's a continuing kind of a battle within. And again, structures ALF is a collective. Decisions are taken internally about how we work these things out. So yeah.
Right. Now, the ALF by design or by default, I don't know which one, is an extremely political space in terms of you're not a political party, but you have people with different political leanings who have been across time part of ALF, and these are also, as they are disruptive. In terms of the conversation cannot be a monolithic one, right? I can't imagine of any of conversations in ALF at any point in time being a monolithic conversation or a unidimensional one, because there are so many participants in that conversation. And you've had, of course, there was a period in which I think it's that 2009ish, that period where the entire thing was about queer rights. You became a hub for that kind of work, and in fact, people would say ALF has just become an LGBT organization. Right? And then you had a Clifton kind of a character, right? Who was, even in aesthetics, quite a Che Guevara like, this football playing revolutionary, and there's a point in which you see it getting pulled in that direction, where more and more left oriented causes are being taken up. Then you had disruptions of the feminists in the organization. So these are both disruptions, now in hindsight perhaps constructive, but when these disruptions happened, can you recall it anecdotally, these different phases of ALF? Can we break it down into different phases? Because in the beginning, it seemed very inspired by PUCL kind of a model, which is that, we just doing human rights lawyering work and some amount of scholarship, but it was very political in different phases.
Yeah, I think the point of ALF has been a collective. So the energies have come from that, where we have valued each person's contribution in terms of the passions and the energies they bring to the task. And sometimes it's true that you've been working on an issue for some time. That person is not that ability to take that forward is not as strong because that person is not there. Because ALF, again, how do you sustain a collective? A collective can only be sustained if the person is passionate about the work that they do. If the person is not passionate, it's very tough because you can't have a top-down command structure in a collective. The two don't go together. That has its strengths. It has its weaknesses. The It's perceived as a weakness. You're right. At some points in time, ALF is seen as maybe more passionately involved with LGBT rights, but then that's also a perception, because it's just the fact that was the issue which was in the national headlines and etc. at that time. But the other working with slums or working on socioeconomic rights continued. It was a little maybe not talked about, but it was built up during that period of time. Give you an example. Give you one example. That is around the same time the NAS litigation 2009 etc. happens. The range of fact findings which were actually done on deaths of persons in manual scavenging, right? And the media didn't cover it, and neither did the people who talking about ALF cover that. They didn't say that, hey, you're also working on this issue, because they only saw what the media saw, which is the NAS kind of a litigation kind of an effort. And of course, but all that work on fact findings on manual scavenging finally resulted in the litigation, which was filed by PUCL at that time, and on manual scavenging, and which resulted in a range of reliefs which came from the court, including the question of compensation and including the entire question of of machinery, which should replace people going into manholes. But that was happening simultaneously. So my point is more that don't think any point ALF was this or that. It was all at the same time, but just some parts became more visible at different points in time, which is the way the media operates, I think, as you as a media person know that. And it's not necessarily the truth of what was happening at that moment in time. Uh, if you want to just maybe one story or a narrative which I'll share about, maybe it's useful for people to think about this, of even the entire question of deaths and manual scavenging and how activism can actually happen. When death and manual scavenging happens, what you get is often a two-line column in the newspaper saying person so and so died while cleaning a manhole. So what our colleagues did at that moment in time, Clifton and others, is they'd go to that place, do a fact finding of what happened, submit a report to the State Human Rights Commission, saying compensation should be given. So that was the starting point, as it were, and that triggered that process of change, as it were, and triggered a range of, again, work and activism around the entire issue. So I think diverse ways of activism were happening within ALF, and again allied organizations and people at that time. Again, ALF is just one among really many people who are involved in this kind of work. So again, it's not fair to just say ALF did this or ALF did that. I think if you're asking for the model is ALF in collaboration with. That's always been the model. It's never ALF did this. ALF in collaboration with is the model of every kind of work which ALF has done. Even the NAS litigation was in collaboration with, or we were representing voices against 377, etc. So there's a way in which you're working as much as you can with other groups and organizations.
Right. I do want to also understand now this effort, right, of human rights lawyering. If you see people who have done it over a sustained period of time, there are two ways in which they have done it. Either they have done, they have a decent ratio of pro bono to paid or highly paid work, and then a portion of their work is pro bono. And the other are these people who've really, gone out on a limb to just, you have a Balagopal, or why not an Arvind Narrain or a Clifton, or so many of you out there, and there've been generations of lawyers. I can keep naming them. I mean, there's Aarti Mulkor in the beginning when she was doing all this work, and there's but then you see that after a point they go into, it's not sustainable. This going out on a limb, this thing of being a Balgopal, is not sustainable, and they then go into this model of pro bono ship. Now, how difficult is it to sustain financially an organization such as the ALF to deal with the bare minimum expenses? The fact that people have cross-subsidized their work anyway. You have some kind of a ceiling on salaries, right? Even that, how do you manage it? And is it sustainable for somebody who can't take that financial hit?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what is sustainable, what is not? But I think you work with the circumstances you're in, and you work with what is possible within the framework that you have. What is it that you can offer as a salary depends also on what is it that you can raise as resources. So that's the connecting link. And so people who can, that's a very good point. People who can make this choice are people who have some element of resources. Otherwise, it's very tough. It's very tough. You're right. Because you're coming to Bangalore, it's a new city, you live in the city. So if you have family who's supportive, it's always easier. If you don't have family supportive, it's much more difficult. So all these are very challenging questions.
Just as it is in journalism also. Yeah. Like all of us were working here, if there was like, a home loan and kids to deal with and all that, it would have been very difficult for us, but that's it, I suppose, essentially, which makes it difficult to sustain, and perhaps to an extent inaccessible, you think, for some sections to be passionate about human rights law can have disastrous consequences. If you're from a first generation Dalit family, let's say, for example, journalism, I've started discouraging people, saying that if you have that backup at home where you can say first 5-10 years the salary doesn't matter, then come into journalism. How does that work in your case?
I think you're right about that. People make choices based on their own circumstances. So that'll be for some people, for example, their salary in ALF would be something which is adequate or which is useful. Other people maybe it's not doesn't help solve your particular situation as far as home is concerned. That's a choice people make. So this is what you have to offer. If you can take it, you take it. If you can't take it, you can't take it. Either way, there's no judgment. That's all one can do. And in an ideal world, of course, what you should be able to do, I think, is think in terms of some kind of a scholarship model, some way in which you support, right? Maybe an internship or a period of time for people who can't afford to do this kind of work. For example, I mean, some places like the Asim Premji University, they had this discussion for some time of doing, of encouraging people to take to practice, right? And and they of course have resources. So what they should do, and what they should ideally do, is have a scholarship for people who want to do this kind of work, precisely from the backgrounds you're referring to, saying we're giving you monthly allowance of such and such amount, for do the work that you want to do, and no strings attached. You want to do other work, you do other work, but this is to do this kind of work. But that's again, it's an interesting question, but that's a thing in terms of thinking about, say, a broader issue of support for marginalized groups within a broader ecosystem of funding, and that's I think an important question, and unfortunately we haven't cracked that answer either within or in the broader ecosystem of this kind of work.
Right. Now, speaking of answers that we haven't cracked, I mean, that's what this discussion is generally about. If we can raise some questions, if we can provoke some thoughts. Speaking of questions which are unresolved, I picked up on this very interesting conversation you were part of. I want to move now into your LGBTQ queer your politics and the things you've been engaged with. There's a talk where you spoke about how can you agitate for queer rights in the time of fascism, or for that matter, what can the queer rights movement do to defeat fascism, and many derivations thereof, saying that why take on fascism in the first place, why should the movement take on. So set the ground first, and I'll hopefully have some supplementaries, but this question itself, why should people from an existing marginality who have the challenge of organizing their own people, why should they be bothered about larger struggles?
See, one might be a kind of almost a pragmatic response. The pragmatic response would be that what has been the impact of what you call fascism on LGBTQ communities in the world over, right? And you go back to Nazi Germany, we all know about the Nazi persecution of the Jews and the Romas and the disabled people and the homosexual community, right? And so the idea of the Nazi, or the perfect Aryan type, meant that the homosexuals had to be exterminated as well. So there's a way
blonde,
in which
white, and cishet.
Yeah. So that famous, which everybody quotes, which in fact I quote at the end of the book, right? The Pastor Niemöller quote. First they came for the Jews, I did not speak up. They came for the communists, I did not speak up. When they finally came for me, there's nobody left to speak up. That's one kind of an answer as to why, as LGBTQ communities, as queer people, we need to be concerned about fascism. That's one kind of an answer. But I think perhaps the other answer would also be look at what does fascism seek to do? It seeks to control choices people make about their lives. It seeks to control choices about who you choose to love or who you choose to be with. It is a control or a way of monitoring the right to love. And the right to love is the more fundamental right, which the queer movement is very concerned and very passionate about. And the right to love, again, you go back to the Navtej judgment. There's a place where the then Justice Chandrachud makes the point. He says the right to love is not just a right for the LGBT community, it's a right for all of us. And so that's the point being that when you're advocating against 377, you're advocating for the right to love. The right to love is really you're challenging the criminalization of unnatural sex or what the law calls carnal intercourse against the order of nature. The question, of course, is what is the order of nature in the Indian context? In the Indian context, the order of nature was transgressed if you love across lines of caste, if you love across lines of religion, and if you love across lines of gender and sexuality. So there's a way in which the right to love is a right not just for the LGBT community, but a battle for all of us.
Endogamy, right? The entire
Yeah.
concept of endogamy, and the fact that if love were to be a river, endogamy is this artificial dam, which seeks to kind of control love and sexuality and things like that. Now, that's an interesting point of intersection that you pointed out to, right? Which is that yes, there is this right to love, and how this right to love is something that becomes essential for people of all kind of marginalities. But from a constitutional point of view, and I want to draw you into that if I can, which is that the right to love derives from the recognition of the right of the individual, as opposed to the state, as opposed to society, which may have its imaginations of a monolith. The fact that these are about individual rights. So there is an important point of intersection over there, because all of these minorities are essentially talking about their right to be different in the way they assemble, in the way they practice and profess, whatever it is that they believe in. The other concept, Arvind, and this is something you speak about a lot, and you speak a lot about Ambedkar and his contribution to the concept of dignity, right? The concept of humiliation, and you cited in this talk about what trans communities or what queer communities can do against fascism. You cited the example of Chelsea Manning, right? This standout beacon of human rights activism, because in the end of the day, and Assange of course suffered, and all of that, but nevertheless, the fact that the fount of this movement for transparency, for accountability, came from somebody from that kind of a marginality. It gave it a certain moral force in those courtroom hearings and things like that. But dignity doesn't mean the same thing to each of those people who can associate with that term, who can identify that term and say, hey, yeah, that means something to me. But what it means to you is very different. How, therefore, do you bring about solidarities? Because that's a theme of all of your work, to build these solidarities.
It's a great way to think about it. You say right to love, but right to love, in a sense, comes within the broader, as you're saying, a broader rubric, right? And the broader rubric could be the right to life. But what you're saying, which I agree with, is it also comes under the right to dignity, right? And again, you go back to the question of what do you mean by dignity? One dimension of dignity is your right to make decisions about your personal or intimate life. Obviously, when somebody is telling you who you should love or how you should love, that's an infringement of a personal, very intimate realm of choice, and it's an infringement of your right to dignity. In a similar way, when you are marked out on grounds of your caste or humiliated on grounds of your caste, that's again an infringement of the right to dignity. If you're prohibited from entering a certain space because of the caste that you come from, that's an infringement of your right to dignity. If you're prevented from marrying across lines of caste, it's an infringement of your lines of
If you're
dignity.
forced to shout Jai Shri Ram, it's a violation of your dignity, right? For a Muslim man, so many times. So that thing, right? Yeah, go on, please. Yeah,
absolutely. So again, you reference the constitution, and if you go back to the Puttaswamy judgment, it makes the argument quite powerfully, I must say. If you read the privacy judgment, which is Puttaswamy is a privacy judgment, it talks about, when you say privacy is not what you'd call a zonal notion. It's a decisional notion, which means it's not just about what you do in the privacy of your bedroom. It's about your right to make decisions about your personal life, including your right to choose your religion, your right to choose your food, your right to choose your identity, your right to choose your sexuality, your right to choose your partner. All of these things come within the question of privacy and dignity. So privacy and dignity are very closely linked in the constitutional imagination. So in a sense, what I'm saying, what we're saying, is that your battle is to preserve this value of dignity. And dignity, again, going back to the Ambedkarite imagination, is an imagination of the individual against society, the individual against state. Why dignity becomes so critical is you think of dignity fundamentally in the context of society. Because society imposes upon you often a level of humiliation, which we don't recognize enough. Again, when you say human rights, and you talked about the human rights notion, what we learned from Ambedkar is society is a fountainhead of humiliation. Society can impose upon you ways of living which impair your right to a dignified life. That could be on grounds of sexuality, on grounds of gender, on grounds of caste, on many other grounds, on grounds of disability, range of grounds in which the way people around you deal with you is an incredible marker of humiliation. So, in a constitutional sense, what you're saying is you're fighting to preserve the value of dignity, and it has many manifestations. And again, as a human rights person, your point will be, how do you fight to preserve this dignity in its varied manifestations? So that's the linking point of a range of
How
these
do you unite
humiliations.
around dignity, you mean? Now, okay, so how do you unite around dignity? And the reason I said that dignity means different things to different people is because a Dalit could violate the dignity of a Muslim could violate the dignity of a Dalit, a gay man could violate the dignity of a trans person could, it often, the notion of dignity brings people perhaps even in conflict, or, not, it's not the same, also means that a lot of your organizing is also to consolidate people of your people, around your call for dignity. So in the case of queer organizing or Dalit organizing or Muslim organizing, or organizing around ethnicities such as people from the Northeast in Bangalore, let's even say, there is an intersection in terms of, if you sit them down and say, hey man, this is all in the end of the day a question of dignity, then this question also comes up. And those I see over time, I've noticed this happening. And the reason it's not something just theoretical, it's something that I'm saying anecdotally. I've seen movements falling apart on these questions. For example, you had the Rohit Vemla movement, and that was a great watershed movement, because for the first time in my career, I saw like people who would not otherwise be seen together on the same platform. You had queer rights activists, you had people from, Kashmiri activists, Northeast activists, all of the Karthik Bittu Kondaya, who's from Bangalore, he was one of the faces of that movement back there for a brief while and all of that. And then what did it come apart on the question of the fact that the dignity of A was violated by B in that same formation of people whose life has been defined by indignities heaped upon them. How much of a problem do you think this is in building solidarities? Because you are in your book also this. Okay, by the way, guys, you must read this book. This is India's Undeclared Emergency. It is 2 years old now.
2020, I think it came out. Yeah.
Oh, it's 4 years old now. Okay.
4 years. Yeah.
4 years old, but this is an interesting book to read. It's a very interesting compilation of all these atrocities that have happened under the Modi regime. And Arvind's obsession in that, or like real thing that he's grappling with, is how do you build solidarities? In this appeal again to the queer community, you talk about what can queer communities do against fascism. So in that scheme of things, people, how do you build these?
It's a good question. And you're right. I mean, it's easy to say what I'm saying, but it's more difficult to get that done in practice, right? Because the ideas, again, of people coming in conversation with each other, or groups of people coming in conversation with each other, and each one learning to appreciate the humanity of the other. That's the challenging space one is in. But I think we've come a long way, as you yourself indicated. This idea of the Rohit Vemla protest, where a range of groups from people from different political persuasions, identity groupings, coming together was a starting point. It's not happened before. First time it's happening. It fell apart at some point in time. And that's the nature of the way things are. I think that will happen. But the fact that people came together, I think, is the important starting point. And I think the idea of building those cycles of communication, building the cycles of participation, people coming together in common activities, is one way in which you deal with these tensions and these stresses around questions of identity and selfhood. That's one. But the other point, I think, is the question of how do you not, it's a challenging question, it's not easy. How do you not take your own identity as the be all and the end all? How do you leave a little space for the fact that people need time to learn and to understand as well? That is, you understand that this is the first time, speaking from a queer rights perspective, this might be the first time that people are actually grappling with the fact that the people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, in the course of that, they may make mistakes, they may misgender, they may refer to in terms which are problematic, right? Uh, one must have the space to say that mistakes can happen, and there is a space for learning. There's space for growing together on this point. Sometimes I think we are too quick to judge other people and too quick to take offense on various identity markers. And I think that's, in a sense, it's also the problem of identity. Identity is it's a passionately held sense of self-identification. And the more passionately held it is, the more you feel that it has to be defended against any form of an attack. I understand where it comes from. I understand the passion which it evokes. I understand the emotion which it evokes. But at the same time, how do you leave a certain space for a sense that, it's okay, people can make mistakes, and there's a space for honest conversation. There's a space for moving towards some wider imagination. So I think somewhere that question of wider imagination is important. So you can allow space for mistakes which may happen in the course of conversations one has with other people. Again, easier said than done, but that's the imaginative horizon we need to move towards.
Interesting you say that, because when it comes to humiliation, see, if you look at the Atrocities Act, there's a component dealing with the physical violence, but the entire point of an SC/ST Atrocities Act is that for the first time it recognizes the concept of indignity and humiliation. Humiliation is a concept that otherwise, avachya shabdagalali baidru, which is a standard statement in any FIR where somebody has bashed you up on the road. Avachya shabdagalali, which means what does it mean in this thing? Which in unspeakable words you were abused.
Yeah.
You were abused in unspeakable language. Okay, so that's the standard. But language, Arvind, would you consider that is a vehicle for humiliation? Literally, I mean, language is the favorite vehicle of humiliation, right? In a sense,
I'm in complete agreement with you on that point. Yeah.
And in this somehow people from identities, essentially, where some identities might have been reclaimed, let's even say, right? So somebody saying, yes, I'm a chamar, I'll do chamar rap. Yes, I'm a hijra, and I will assert myself, with this set of this lexicon, let's say, this vocabulary, and this attempt to break the grammar of language, break the patriarchal grammar of the heteronormative patriarchal grammar of language. This is an effort, I would say, from many ends. Women are trying to do it. Adivasis are trying to do it, saying, we are not, what do you call that? Janjati, what? Vanvasi. We are not Vanvasi. We are, so many other ways in which people are trying to look at language, and it acquires a certain sanctity, right, over a period of time, that you can't use certain terms. And, okay, I don't know if you have picked up the glossary that we came up with. So Raga Mallika, my colleague, and a few others, we, in collaboration with the News Minute, we had this glossary of terms. I want you to answer this question of dismissal of the question of why you've obsessed with language, and what is this woke culture and all that, and this very interesting development since NAS. So if NAS was about decriminalization, the Chennai High Court accepting that glossary in Tamil and saying that this is an ideal set of terms of to be used to address LGBTQ communities. The courts engaging with the question of language. It is a very important thing now, and who knows going forward, if a slur is a crime in an SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act, a slur may be a crime somewhere else. These are the directions in which we are moving. At that time, should we be making concessions?
It's a good question, and I think one way to think about this is the material politics and the symbolic politics, and the fact that while we address the question of the symbolic, we should not be consumed by it. we should also have the space of the mind, the time to address the questions of the material. On the question of caste again, I think the overwhelming violation of the entire issue of, for example, manual scavenging should be on the top of our minds.
The
And that's
material.
something which we should not lose sight of. And that's the only caution I'm drawing. I'm saying that sometimes we can get drawn into the battles of the symbolic
Or land, like Teltumbre often talks about. The
and
question of
forget
land.
the questions of the material. Be it the question of land, be it the question of manual scavenging, be it a range of material violations which are forgotten. Again, I'm not at any level saying that the symbolic does not matter. It matters deeply. But I think my point is a more narrower one, which is when we were talking in the context of intersectionality, and in intersectionality, assume that people come in good faith, right? And people come in good faith and they're trying, grappling, trying to learn. And I'm saying in the context of colleagues or comrades who are trying to learn, we must have a little bit of a space for mistakes made. That's the limited point I was making.
No, that's an important point. To sustain this ALF kind of a
Conversation.
formation.
Yeah,
Let's
yeah.
even say, because these are conversations. When I said disruptions, these some of these disruptions that I've noticed, in ALF or in those
Yeah.
civil society circles, threaten to at some point take the horse away from the cart. To make them go in different directions. But then somewhere, this thing of keeping it together, that
Yeah, we're
fraternity.
all to have a sense of where I completely disagree with your opinion on LGBT rights, but we're in the same page on the broader question of fascism. It's not an easy position to hold because obviously we are very passionate about the issue of LGBT rights, and it's very difficult to converse maybe with people who don't take it seriously. But at the same time, if you are on the same page on the question of fascism, and if you're going to be there on, say, a protest on the Palestine issue, I mean, would my dismissal, saying that I'm not going to engage with you because you're not or with me on the question of LGBT rights, am I doing more harm to my broader cause? They're not. It's a question I need to think about. I mean, they're not easy answers, but you need to consider it. You can't dismiss it out of hand saying that this is my identity. I don't care anything else. If you're not fully or with me, you're against me. That can't be. Again, who am I to say that can't be? I say that can't. That's not my outlook. Put it simply.
But that is the outlook in some way of
Yeah.
this organization which I want to talk about next. Okay, which is the PUCL. Okay, you are the state president of the PUCL. Now I can catch you on this one. I've always had these questions about PUCL. How did they bring those people together from? So you have So you have a Jayaprakash Narayan, who, against the backdrop of the emergency of the, in fact, even before the emergency, he had some formations for democracy, and this he wanted to have bipartisan discussions around rule of law, around the normative state. You use this term a lot, the normative state, which is that the state can, the different ideologies can be in power politically, but the state has a certain normative function, which is rule of law, all of that. So Jayaprakash Narayan's motivations I can understand, but then in the mix you have someone like an Acharya Kriplani, who's a mystic at best. Very woozy ideas about spirituality, about Hindu life, and all of these. I could even say probably obscurantists to a certain extent. I don't know if that's too harsh a word.
I think it's a fair point.
It's a fair point. Okay, then you have this very left-oriented. I would say, to my mind, he is very left-oriented. Kannabiran, KG Kannabiran, who comes from a Telangana context, which back by the time PUCL or things have been imagined, there's already a history of close to a century in Telangana by then of civil rights movements, of these assertions, and lawyers working alongside revolutionary struggles. Okay, and so Kannabiran comes from this thing, and then of course there's this thing of left. PUCL is a left formation, but if you look at the fact that even an Arun Jaitley and an Arun Shourie also were part of PUCL, who were Jansangh, BJP, all of that. What is this thing? I mean, has the history of the PUCL not fascinated you? How it came together, how it has survived so many years?
Yeah, I'd answer this question. Okay, the two ways. One is, of course, the history of the PUCL linked up to the history of its origins during the emergency, right? And of course, at that moment in time, the imperative during the emergency was the overwhelming authoritarianism of the Indira Gandhi regime, and a way of bringing together the various people who were opposed to then Congress regime.
Times not very different from now.
That's the context in which it emerged, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you want to look at what is the ideology of human rights, that's the question you're asking. I think it's an important question. And the way to answer that is again through the figure you do not invoke is Bal Gopal.
Bal Gopal,
actually.
of course. No,
Yeah.
my mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he has this very brilliant narration of how, in his own thinking, the idea of human rights originated in the Indian context. He says, see, you refer to political persuasions. He said at that time, when they were part of a more left political framework, they would go to the police station to get their left colleague or comrade released because he's being tortured, etc. Right? And so they go to the police station and say that, don't torture him. What you're doing is wrong. It's a violation of the law, etc., etc. At which time the police said, Bal Gopal's narration, police turn around and say that, see, we're also torturing this thief over here. You don't care about him. You only want to release your great political revolutionary. So but Bal Gopal said the police were not interested in the fact that we should care about the thief. The police were interested in exposing a one-sidedness. He says from that we learn one lesson. We can never say torture of a political revolutionary is wrong. We can only say torture is wrong. Which case, it may be a right wing, it may be left wing, it may be a person with ideology, but torture is wrong. That's the human rights philosophy, right? It has its strengths, it has its limitations. But that's where Kannabaran comes from, that's where Bal Gopal comes from, and that's where the human rights thinking really comes from, right? And you have to be able to take that position, which is I wouldn't say neutral, but which in a sense embodies a constitutional ideal, regardless of who the other party is. I'll give you one more example, which Karnataka narrates on this actually. He says he was once arguing for two Naxalite prisoners, right, in a trial court or whatever, and the judge turned around and said, "Mr. Kannabaran, your arguments on the basis of the Constitution, they don't believe in the Constitution." So Kannabaran's response was, "What is on trial is not the ideology of my clients. What is on trial is your ideology." Right? So that's the human rights thinking. So that's I think the strength and the weakness, if you want to put it that way, right? And the weakness, again, the point where you're getting to, which I think is an important point as well, is if you're looking at a question of larger political or social change, what then is a contribution of human rights? Can human rights address questions of inequality? Can human rights address questions of poverty? Can human rights address questions of fascism? Those are the questions you'll have, right? And the answer to that would be, again, using Kannabaran, would be only one answer, which is to say that what you need in a constitutional state is a protection of the right to speech, the right to association, and the right to assembly. The rest is a question of political activism. But that is a bare minimum, which must be safeguarded, regardless of who the party might be. Are there limits on these rights? There are limits on these rights, right? The limits on these rights, of course, is drawn by human rights law again, where you're saying is your right to speech and expression unlimited? It's not. The limit points of the right of speech and expression is the entire question of the incitement to hatred, violence, and discrimination, as far as international law is concerned, stands prohibited by law. Right? So there's a way in which international law understands what the limits of speech are. Again, if you raise the question, okay, speech and expression, great, PUCL is supporting. What about calls to genocide? Simple answer to that is the Genocide Convention criminalizes the incitement to genocide or the direct and public incitement to genocide. So the limit points to freedom of speech and expression itself. So you look at it within the human rights lens and say, is the speech protected speech? Is this association allowed as far as the law and the Constitution is concerned? Is the assembly allowed as far as the law and the Constitution is concerned? So that's the way you look at it. You have to train yourself to look at it within the framework of a rights language. And again, as I repeat one last time, it has its strengths, it has its limitations.
Now, speaking of its limitations and why those limitations are so interesting and they provide for such exciting kind of deviations from starting from human rights, because let's say somebody is talking about human rights and in the context of holding the state to account, right? You're talking about a Kannabiran, beautiful. Sorry, was it a Bal Gopal or Kannabiran who
Both of
said?
them.
Both of them said the same,
Yeah.
saying that my client is not on trial. The state is on trial. The question here is, does the state believe in the constitution or not? Not whether my Naxalite client, alleged Naxalite colleague, believes in it or not. So that's a beautiful formulation of, what human rights lawyering is. But the question, the contradiction that, so at some point, many human rights lawyers have had this revelation that yes, you're holding the state to account, but you are looking at the state as the normative state, as the state which is made up of functional units. The job of a human rights advocate is to make those units function, make the police function, make the judiciary function, make the executive branches function. Now, a Clifton Rosario would say that it is not just the state, it's also who politically controls the state, that there's an ideology in control of the state, and that ideology should be fought through political organizing combined with lawyering. Right, and on that count, a lot of people who were in pharmacists such as the PUCL or people who are purely in the human rights law background, started seeing a problem with being the medics. The medics, in terms of, there are people who are on the front lines, and then you are the triad center attending to people who are wounded. Right, to take that a step further and say, no, we are as much. If I'm a soldier in the army, if I'm a medic in the army, I'm also a soldier in the army. This kind of an attitude. Does it not become one constant cycle of, this happening again and again and again and again, where the criticism is not, again, to be trifled with, that human rights lawyers could be more political, you think?
You see, this question could be put in, it sounds more abstract than it actually is, because the reality is that what are the issues we are fighting with? We are fighting the issue of freedom of speech, expression, assembly, association. What is the entire question of the Bangalore police restrictions on right to protest? What is the question of, the restrictions on social media posting? What is the entire question of, of the UAPA? What is it trampling with? What is it infringing on? The right to association, right? So these are issues which I think not just human rights lawyers, but everybody should be concerned with. Because again, what is a democracy? Democracy is one which allows for you to utilize or to develop these rights. Because again, what we are fundamentally saying is, how does the process of transformation happen? The process of transformation happens is when your ideology is allowed to develop. How is the ideology how can your ideology develop? First, you must have a platform to speak. Secondly, you must be able to form associations, right? And you must be able to protest on the streets. Those are rights which a human rights organization should fight for, regardless of who the ideology on the streets may be, keeping in mind the limitation of of hate speech and the way the limit points of these rights, as it were, keeping that in mind, right? That being said, I would say that I would agree with you in the sense that human rights is not the panacea to the problems of the world. It's a certain approach, saying certain things fundamentally you must protect, right? You must protect. The answers will come from organizing on the street and from different kinds of ideological formations. But the ideological formation should be allowed to emerge. If you don't have a state which allows for these ideological formations to emerge, for the vibrant kinds of assertions to emerge, then how do you allow for justice or democracy to be debated? That would be the way to look at it. So I think the idea of a human rights organization is, I wouldn't say use language of medic. I would more use it as a language of, how do you make your democracy an associative democracy? How do you make your democracy a functional democracy based on the question of the guarantee of speech, association, and assembly, and a vibrant democracy? And that's really the challenge of a human rights organization.
Speech and assembly, essentially freedom of speech only. The other two are derivations of it, the concept of freedom of speech.
Not really. Because see, the question of speech again, right? If I'm speaking, you're speaking. If our speech is not heard, it makes no difference. How does speech get heard? Speech gets heard when you have the right to associate. What is the right to associate really based on? It's not an abstract question again. The right to associate really based on very important questions, right? question, for example, I mean, the question which I think you are also, as an organization, I'm sure, dealing with, which is the entire question of, can you open a bank account as an organization? Today in this country, an unregistered organization can't open a bank account. We could do it in the past. The NBA could have a bank account. Today it can't. If the PUCL is an unregistered association, it's difficult. It's challenging to have a bank account. If you don't have a bank account, how do you form an association? Then forget the other challenges, right? I mean, FCRA, that question doesn't even arise for range of organization. Again, FCRA, right? Foreign contributions. What are foreign contributions about? They're really about fructifying the right to association. You take in place an organization which is an organization of people which is held in contempt for grouping within your own society. Why should you not reach out for funding from outside? I mean, why are you stuck with only what is within the country? What is this entire question of, only within the country, right? So association is a separate right from speech, and it's a very important right? And the laws regulating associations, right from the FCRA to the Societies Act, to range of these laws, to Trusts Act, to the ATG exemptions, all of this, to the ability to open bank accounts, infringe on the right to associate, right? And we can, this other dimensions right to associate, of course, which is why is association important? When you say you can all speak, it's a meaningless thing to say we can all speak, right? You can speak when you're in association with other people. That's when your voice really emerges, right? Because again, speech emerges when there's a freedom from fear. How do you achieve a state of freedom from fear? Freedom from fear is linked to the question of 2 people or 3 people or 4 people coming together, because that's when your fearlessness happens. Fearlessness comes from being together, right? And that's association. And assembly, of course, is the question of that, again, the right that a large bunch of people getting together and making their voice heard on a larger public platform, right? And that's the entire question of assembly. Sorry, assembly is the third kind of right. So 3 are very distinct and very important rights.
Distinct, but still, to my mind, very deeply connected to Gandhi's engagement with in the question of sedition, the question of protest. And the reason I bring up Gandhi, of course, is because this is my last segment, if you will. We have touched this 1 hour mark, but this is one thing in which I wanted to actually delve a lot deeper than I will now have time for. But as somebody who studies and probably even has deep engagement with Gandhian ethos, you talk often about the right to freedom, the freedom of speech, association, and assembly. Are 3 things on which he really took the government to the cleaners, the British establishment back then. Sedition, saying the right to have disaffection towards the government. So
the line on that is, affection cannot be manufactured or regulated by law. If you feel no affection, you should be allowed to express your lack of affection fully.
Right. Now, so Gandhi is somebody you and I have kind of often either disagreed with,
passionately disagreed.
Passionately disagreed.
Way to put it.
But in some of what I gather from what you've said of over the years, this thing of right to assembly, speech, association is one aspect of Gandhi's contribution. The other thing, you tell me, you speak about this greed, need, and how it connects to sustainability, to some kind of ecocentrism, some engagement with the environment around us. This Gandhi's thing of there is enough for need and not for greed. These are the 2 things you often say are the standout features of this thing. So I'll offer this provocation, you can respond. So my thing would be that freedom of speech, assembly, and association means very little for somebody who is not part of the conversation, who does not have the capacity, or who does not have the social capital to associate across lines, who's boxed into a certain category and has no option to associate, to assemble. So therefore, this thing of freedom of speech for whom is one question that often comes up, and therefore, is it freedom of speech or the ability to speak? The ability to speak is something which goes in a completely different direction, because you're talking about, the Mook Nayak, the person who is not able to speak. That's how Ambedkar came up with that title for that magazine.
The answer is in that question itself. Your answer is in your question, in your provocation, as you put it, right? Uh, Ambedkar's entire articulation is really based on ability to publish that particular paper called the Muknayak, right? Is the ability to get your word out to a larger public. And you're right. It's very why do you have to why do you have to form the Muknayak? Is because the mainstream media, nationalist media, refuse to cover anything which Ambedkar is writing and Ambedkar is doing. So what do you have to do? It establish his own paper, as it were, right? So the challenge is there. I mean, you're right. The challenge is there, but I would say that the answer to that challenge is a deeper rooting or a seeding of these three rights. If you look at what did Ambedkar rely on to get his word out? Speech, expression, association. That's the heart of it, That's the heart of it. So you have to protect these rights. And the question of what the law is called content neutrality, right? Human rights activists will say these rights need to be protected. Gandhi may use it for taking forward his thinking. Ambedkar may use it for taking forward another line of thinking, right? But that base right has to be protected. So here I'd have to, in that sense, disagree with you, where you say, what is speech for people who can't speak? So the Kanamaran's response to that is you have to enable speech by those who can't speak. How do you enable speech by those who can't speak? Again, the question of association becomes very, very central. If you think of the entire question of Narmada Bachao Andolan, think of the entire question of, the struggle of against manual scavenging, think of the range of all of that is based on what? Speech and association. Speech, association, assembly. That's what it's all based on, So it's critical. These three rights are critical for any grouping who is trying to get their voice out into the wider public. And the only question we have is the fact that the wider public doesn't want these voices out, right? So your challenge is how do you get these voices out? Not to say these rights are not important. Say these rights are absolutely vital, absolutely critical. How do we ensure that groups at the very bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum can access these rights fully? And the many challenging questions around them. Are you talking about formation of separate newspapers? Are you talking about like Muknayak? Are you talking about existing newspapers in which there should be a space, there should be a compulsory space for a range of voices? Are you talking about media should be publicly owned with a certain way in which what kind of coverage should media do? The range of ways one can think of these answers. But are these rights vital for every grouping? They're absolutely vital for every grouping.
Right, and the second part about with this austere this thing right now, where we're talking about consumption. If there's if at all there can be limits to consumption, when you hear Gandhi often talking about sustainability, it's sustainability in terms of greed. Again, there you talk about when the conversation is about redistribution, when the conversation is about who is consuming, who is over consuming. Even climate, if you're trying to connect it to climate saying that this concept is very helpful in conversations around climate justice. Even there, the conversation today is about proportionality, right? And saying who is the greater polluter and what should their liability be, and historically who's the greater polluter and all of that. That limitation. So he stops short of saying anything, let's even say, radical in that sense, because if you're attacking greed, then you're not attacking the question of hegemony, let's say, or cornering of resources.
It's an interesting question. See, if you're attacking what again if you were there in Janaki Nair's talk the other day on Gandhi's thinking, what she calls is a parigraha, right? The non-possessiveness, right? Is the idea which is being challenged, which is being combated, right? And how do you build a culture of non-possessiveness? Again, who is non-possessiveness targeted towards? Not towards those are nothing. Those are everything, right? So no, you're telling the wealthy to cultivate a parigraha. So that's, the target is clear. Not those with nothing. So when you say Gandhi says the earth has enough for each man's need, not enough for each man's greed. Who are the greedy? Not those at the very bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum, right? So in effect, you're asking for redistribution, not through a Marxist lens, right? Which is a good critique to make. So the critique is What, just because you say give up things, will people give up? That's a fair critique to make, right? But the who is it targeted at? Is those who are wealthy. And again, see, this is a very important point actually, because again, this is Professor Bakshi's argument. He says the fundamentally look at economics, right? Economics goes on the principle that your needs are unlimited and resources are limited. Says Gandhi takes a different turn on that. He says the only way is your needs have to be limited. And who is that targeted at? Targeted at the wealthy. They're the ones who saying your needs need to be limited. So there's a way in which I think it ties in to the question of redistribution, the question of the means of redistribution. Means are where I think your point is a fair one, where just because you say give it up, will people give it up? How will people give up the wealth that they have? Should they be forced to give up the wealth, which is the communist answer, or will they give it up through an appeal to their conscience, which is the Gandhian answer? Or do we have to think of some, again, going back to the question of conversation, do we have to think of a way forward, which is a mixture of both? There must be an appeal to the moral imagination and moral conscience. There
And
must
that
be
is where Ambedkar comes in. He says that an appeal to the conscience is not the solution. It is legislation. And
Can I respond to that? You go to Ambedkar's, again, the conditions precedent for the working of a constitution, right? One point he talks about, which I think a really brilliant point. He says what we lack in this country is what he calls a public conscience. What he means by public conscience, he says that when the other chap is suffering, I should be moved by that suffering. What caste does, it prevents that, right? The other person is dispensable, doesn't matter, right? So you have to be able to cultivate that public conscience. So in my understanding, right, Ambedkar is also very invested in the idea, how do you transform a way of thinking? Very invested in that, which is not to say he's not invested in the law, right? The law, again, what is the law as far as Ambedkar is concerned? The law is a tool to ensure representation, clearly. That's one part of it. The law is also a tool to criminalize a practice of untouchability with Article 17 kind of a thing. The law is a tool to combat discrimination by society, which is Article 15.2, saying that, you can't deny me my right to access a water body in equal rights with every other person. But the law is also a tool to cultivate what he calls constitutional morality and fraternity. So how do you cultivate that sentiment, that sensibility, where the other man matters, right? And that's a very important point. In fact, I think for both Gandhi and Ambedkar, both. So here, actually, this maybe I'll make the last point, and Sudhito, you're going to kill me at this moment because you'll have lots more to say, which is the question of since we're talking about. I mean, I think you've given in my so far what I've heard from you, the most sympathetic reading of Gandhi I ever heard you give is today. Ever, right? And so the question of thinking of Gandhi and Ambedkar together, I think is an imperative task. The way I see it, right? And again, this is not me saying it. Going back to Devanur Mahadeva and the flaming feet, right? His argument is that he says that we have to be able to think these two. Not Devanur Mahadeva, I'm saying D.R. Nagaraj in the flaming feet, and Devanur Mahadeva, of course, is making the same point as well. D.R. Nagaraj is making the point of see. When you say Gandhi and Ambedkar, what is his point? He says they had a public debate, right? What is the point of a public debate? We're having a debate here. A debate is only valuable if my opinion changes a little bit because of what you're saying, and your opinion changes a little bit because of what I'm saying. And my feeling is your opinion changed a little bit because of what I said. That's the way I read your response to Gandhi today, right? And that public debate is what happens. So we don't fix them in terms of what was said at a moment in time. We say that people change through the nature of a conversation. Gandhi, who was the first in the initial opinion cast, changes by the later period. Ambedkar's opinion as well changes over a period of time. In fact, I'll just make the last point and a bit on an annihilation of caste. I was reading it again, right? And the point I found, which I hadn't realized till this reading, is he says annihilation of caste is a destruction of faith in the Hindu religion. What is that based on? He says it's based on the question of a faith in the Hindu scriptures, the Dharma Shastras and the Vedas. Right? That's what he says. And then he goes on, of course, Ambedkar is always a thinker who wants to destroy, who also wants to create. He's always saying this needs to go, but something else needs to emerge. So he says that what needs to emerge is a new world based on liberty, equality, fraternity. Where will you draw that from? Where will you draw that new imagination from? And this is something which I rereading Annihilation Caste. He says, I'm trying to quote him. He says, I'm not the expert, but I've heard or I've read that it could potentially be the Upanishads. To go back to a reconstruction of what the idea of Hinduism may mean. He says, I'm not an expert. And of course, the final point is, he says, I'm exiting this religion. That's the final point, right? But this small line which he leaves open, saying, those of you all who are within, you can potentially reconstruct your religion on the basis of the Upanishads. Why the Upanishads? Again, you go back to the idea, right? The idea of the Upanishads is the idea that when you say that all persons are divine, then you take a different line. Then caste is philosophically untenable within that framework within the Upanishadic thinking. And Upanishadic thinking again is based on the idea that you question everything, you challenge everything, Nachiketa, that entire line. So there's a way in which the religion of rules, right, which is what Ambedkar is so critical of in Annihilation of Caste, right, might be the critique might actually draw or might actually lead towards the entire question of can you reconstruct something on the framework of the Upanishads? That's again, my point is, it's not Ambedkar's doing that. He's explicitly saying, I'm leaving your religion. So you all fellows are still there. You want to reconstruct. Look closely at the Upanishads and what basis it has to potentially reconstruct the religion you guys believe so strongly in, right? So that's...
I think just to add to that point, I kind of, agree with that to some extent because of the kind of respect he had for the Bhakti movement, the non-Brahmin movements, the non-Brahmin deities and things like that, and how the Upanishadic thought actually had a huge contributing effect on these various movements. Perhaps, the fact that he appreciates this is a result of the fact that he himself grew up in this tradition of Tukaram and all of that back in Maharashtra. But I mean, this is again, I am not the expert, not a provocation. This is not even a provocation. This is just a reflection, which is that perhaps he had the dual objective of, like you said, destructing and constructing. So while he saw something, he might have seen something constructive here. The reason he left it is also perhaps because he had another option, which is that if the Upanishads are your reference, then he will go back to the inspiration of the Upanishads to some extent, or the reason why Upanishadic thought emerged, which is because of the pressure of Buddhism. So perhaps he said, let's go back there, and I don't know, to the origin of this kind of a dissent within Hinduism.
It's interesting, right? It's interesting. When you go back to the Annihilation of Caste, it's a conference of the Jat Path Todak Mandal, right? It's the people who are trying to say what is the path within Hinduism. So you're trying to give them, he's very clear. This is not my path, but this could be your path. That's the only direction which you should frame that. There may be the multiple paths, and again, which might go back to the idea that working within religion or religious traditions is also an important path forward in the world that we live in. And it's may not be a path which I may take. It may not be a path you could take, but it's a path which we should have the space for, and it's a path which may prove more significant than we factor in our conversations today. My strength is a constitutional way of thinking, constitutional imagination, but I think the point which you get from again Ambedkar's conversion is that saying constitutional imagination thinking is great, but if you want to appeal to a wider segment of people, there's no way outside thinking of religion. You have to think within the framework of religion, work within the text of religion, right? And so that's a path which is, I think, in the Indian context, is a vital path. So we have to build those solidarities with people who are doing that kind of work.
Right. Thank you, Arvind. This is something we could have had an entire session on, and I think we should. I'm just finding my feet in this format. So if you'll allow me, there is the research, and then there is this thing of facing the camera. So as I go forward with this, I will come back and circle back to this conversation. This is essentially, to me, my mind, a question between separatism and integration. And it's not an either or. At different times you need the separatist, to separate from the mainstream and say that the mainstream is wrong, and then you need somebody to come and say, but then you have to integrate as well. And we will have a conversation on this again. Arvind Narrain, thank you so much for coming. It's been a fantastic conversation. I hope to have you here again. That's all we have now on this episode of What's Your Ism. I'll see you again in the next episode. And that reminder I want to leave you with again, which is that you can write to me, you can mail me on sudipto@thenewsminute.com. Please mail with your comments, suggestions. Who should I invite? What should I ask them? Please leave your comments. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time.